Hello and welcome to the IdeaCast interview series, episode number 139. My guest in this episode is Martina Bailey. Martina is a licensed clinical social worker and therapist, and some of her specialties or focus is on working with veterans, healthcare professionals, first responders, and trauma survivors. And in the beginning of the conversation, I invite Martina to share her background story, her childhood development years, and how that helped kind of forge or guide a path to where she is now as a social worker, as somebody helping others. And so we learn about that in the conversation. We also find out more about Martina and the work that she does. I very much enjoyed having her as a guest. I like these kind of stories that we hear from folks like Martina about coming from adversity and channeling that and redirecting that into being someone who can be of help and benefit to others, and I certainly believe Martina is doing that. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. I very much appreciate you all being here, especially my subscribers. Thank you. And I'd like to welcome Martina Bailey to the IdeaCast interview series. We are going to be discussing matters of mental health and well-being and other things that us humans do when we human. So I'm looking forward to learning from Martina and just extracting some wisdom from her and some ideas that we can share, both the two of us talking as well as the audience absorbing. So Martina, welcome. Glad to have you here.
Thank you so much, Justin. I'm so excited to be here.
Well, I'm glad because I've been anticipating this conversation and looking forward to it. So it's likewise. And to the YouTube audience, welcome everyone. Appreciate you being here, especially the subscribers. I always want to mention my subscribers. I appreciate you all so very much. So Martina, what I would, in speaking of people viewing this conversation, let's start by getting them and myself up to speed with your formative years, your career building, and your educational background and the path that you took to get where you are right now. Let's start with that, and then from there we'll move into talking about human stuff.
Well, I went to growing up. I grew up in Arkansas, and then I went to school there, and then I received my undergrad and graduate degree at Brigham Young University. And so I am a licensed clinical social worker, and I specifically specialize in post-traumatic stress disorder. I mean, I feel like if anyone, I get so happy talking about PTSD and how effective treatments for PTSD, right? And so I dedicated my life where my education and being trained in treatments that actually help PTSD, right? Because, disclosure, there was a time where I sought counseling, during college and definitely before I became a therapist in high school for some trauma. And they were not trained in PTSD. When people say, oh, I know PTSD, and it just didn't work for me. And for the longest time, I thought, I'm like, oh, what is wrong with me? Like, why can't I get over this, right? Why can't I get over this childhood trauma that I've had, right? And, I finally, during college, I finally met one of the best therapists I've ever had. And he was trained in specific treatment modalities for PTSD. And that changed my whole life.
Okay.
Right? Where, my body started to calm down. I was like, my mood improved. I felt like a different person where I realized that, for me, like it is important for mental health professionals and for people to actually have the right training.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right? So for me, that's what took me kind of for my journey from PTSD and learning and making sure, everything that I'm trained in is evidence-based, right? Because there was a reason why it was made, right? Because people knew you needed something else. And so that's just my journey.
Okay. In your discovering this wonderful therapist that was able to work with you, again, in that domain of PTSD recovery and healing. Were you on a trajectory of learning to become a therapist, or were you inspired further to, how did that shift your arc of development? And, prior to that, you were sort of,
Yeah.
you were involved in getting yourself in the field of social work and therapy, right? If I,
So I met this therapist during grad school where I'm like,
oh, okay.
yeah, during grad school, as beginning of grad school, as I was in my way developed to become a therapist, right? But with all these professionals and everything, you know, like I was amazed that like with all the professionals I went through, like they were never able to pinpoint it like he did. Does
Mm.
that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so with that really kind of changed my direct trajectory in a way where I realized that like I wanted to specialize in PTSD and wanted to receive those trainings specifically for PTSD, and discovering that I realized that I was really good at it, right?
Mm.
And
Okay.
so that helped change my trajectory and help like kind of see more life as this trauma informed lens, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so I think that definitely, and as a professional where I'm always growing. And so our body is like, I've learned that, a lot of times we think of our mind, body, mental health, spirit health, all separate, but it's all connected, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And if something's wrong with our body, it's going to show up mentally. I can promise you it will show up mentally too,
Mm-hmm.
and vice versa.
Yeah.
And so
Yes.
that's where I'm sort of ranting, so I apologize. So that is where it took me to make sure that like I was a very trained clinician where in the specialty that I picked, right?
Right. Right. Um, Now this is a question I would probably ask any uh, therapist or clinical social worker is, do you recall a moment in your life where you thought, I want to be a social worker or a therapist or a clinician? Where do you recall that wellspring moment where you were just like, this is what I want? Because if there are people listening and they may be 17 or 18 or whatever, and they're like, trying to suss out what they're feeling inside. Can you share to
Yeah.
that?
So when I was in high school, I was like, I wanted to be a doctor,
Hmm.
specifically geneticist, right? Because
Okay.
I was always fascinated with genes and how they work,
Okay.
right? And then I took Chem 105 in high school, no, in college. And I was always so good at math and science. And by the time I was in 10th grade, after 10th grade, I'd taken every science class I could at my school because I love
Okay.
science. And so I got to Chem 105 and I'm like, what did I get myself into? And I got to macrobiology and I was like, I am falling asleep. Right?
Right.
And so I took at BYU, I took Brigham Young University, I took this family recreation class. And like I think we should get into because I grew up in a very just non-conventional like family, right?
Hmm.
And so I took this family recreation class and I was like, wait a minute. I mean, like wait a minute, like this isn't like normal or this isn't like this is how like things are supposed to be. Does that make sense?
Hmm. Hmm.
And so that like I was just fascinated by the systems of how things and relationships and people work that just led me to social work, right? And I just think just small experiences, my own struggles with childhood trauma and just being passionate and trying to find like there has to be something that works. I think that just led me to the trajectory of clinical social work, right? And
Hmm.
because I don't think we talk about enough about mental health, right? And so if you grow up in a family that doesn't talk about or in society, definitely didn't talk about it in the early 2000s as much, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So when you grow up like that, you think maybe being sad or depression, you're like, what's wrong with me? Right. And
Yeah.
so I honestly feel like I took those classes kind of to discover like, oh, like sad, like I'm not supposed to feel sad all the time, right? Or like I'm
Mm-hmm.
not supposed to always feel like hypervigilant all the time or want to people please. And so taking those classes was really a self-discovery, I feel like
Mm.
self-diagnosis, where I'm like, oh, like I think there's something wrong,
Yeah. Hey, that's great, right? You're
right?
unpacking things as you go along. Or
And I think
revealing.
knowledge is power, right? Because when you
Yeah.
know what's wrong, like like what specifically, like specific parts of your body that's like maybe not functioning as well, what kind of specialist to seek,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, physiologically, it's you don't go to a dentist to get a a bone set or anything. I mean, they
Right.
might be able to do it, but it might hurt, might not have the right equipment. But yeah, I get that. I get that, and that extends into the abstracted, domain of the psyche. That you have to. It's like you with the PTSD. You had to land with that right person. That was able to bear fruit with you in terms of,
Mhm.
healing and recovery. Now, I'm going to ask a very basic question because I've never asked this before. And in your training and your education, how is trauma defined on that side, on the the psychoanalytical, the psychotherapeutic side? How would we define trauma for the audience? I mean, it's
Yeah.
obvious and apparent to all of us, but what is the criteria
Yeah.
in a clinical setting?
Right. And I think that's really good because I feel like in today's society, we like trauma is used very loosely right now. Like
Hmm. Hmm.
I think one of my sisters said that she was traumatized from planning her wedding. I'm like, no, it doesn't work that way, right?
Stressful,
So,
maybe.
right, maybe, right, for the cost,
Hmm.
but
Hmm.
right, I mean, in like the clinical terms, trauma is defined as a life-threatening or dangerous situation, right, that makes you feel either physically or emotionally threatened, right? And so there's very specific criteria set about that. So, and like a lot of people just experience trauma, right? So trauma can be from natural disasters, car accidents, witnessing car accidents, childhood trauma, seeing people be abused, or and with trauma, even feeling emotionally abused, you actually feel like that person is you're going to be physically threatened. Okay. So it kind of disturbs your sense of safety,
Okay.
right? And so I mean, the DSM criteria, like you have to like meet specific criteria, but everyone experiences trauma. But what makes PTSD is unique is that there's certain symptoms. So, for example, hypervigilance after you experience a trauma. So always feeling jittery, heat up, and alert, like, and then avoiding situations that reminding you of the traumatic event. I mean, as working with patients, and veterans, there's this theme of maybe like avoiding crowds, right? Or avoiding certain noises or certain people that maybe look like the perpetrator that committed that trauma or crime against you, right? And so with that, and there's also kind of feeling that you're experiencing the trauma again. So can show up in nightmares
Okay.
or something called flashbacks, right? And just all these clusters of symptoms, right? Sometimes a person experience these symptoms, right? But it gradually decrease, right? We call this in therapy kind of this natural recovery cycle where, it makes sense that your body feels threatened, right? Because you were in a threatened situation, right?
Hmm.
But with trauma, we've discovered that if you are in an environment that's conducive to helping you express what you felt, right? Those symptoms actually decrease. And how PTSD comes about is when, you feel like the people are not in like in a conducive environment to help them recover, right? So maybe even after 3 months, or even after a month, 3 months, or again, as working with veterans, when I worked with veterans, even after 20 years, they still have PTSD, right? And so with clinical terms, there's like a specific timeline to meet the PTSD, right? But as a therapist with looking at a trauma-informed lens, I think, I like to kind of expand that because, what may be trauma and what may be not trauma to one person culture may be trauma to another person, right? So I think that's also very important as a clinician to like be able to be knowledgeable about different cultures and how, different cultures they don't take the DSM may not necessarily, may limit their expression of what's going on. So I'm sorry, that's probably a very long-winded answer.
No, I don't. It took a minute, but it's necessary to lay it all out, I think, because like you said, we are saturated right now with that term in the social ecology, or however you want to say that. So I think it's nice in this conversation that we lay down, put some cards on the table that people can read and see, oh, okay, these are the criteria. And again, in context, within the framing of Western culture and the DSM. Now, this question might have some social commentary baked into it, and that's fine. I'm comfortable with this because it's not that controversial, but it seems like in the commons, in our, the United States, we absorb a lot of violence in movies, gaming, and even just TV, the news. You'll see really kind of wacky stuff going on, people getting shot or blown, boom, and or car accidents and things like that, or John Wick movies or The Equalizer, something that's loaded with things that can the mind discern from being in a theater or sitting in front of your huge high def television, and you see kablooey and pow and chunks and parts and all this, and then we come away from that and say, well, it was a fictional event, and I can discern. But I mean, what do you think is being absorbed in that, and how are we as a culture responding to that? So is there a trauma response baked into my sitting and watching John Wick 3 or something, Punisher or whatever is going on out there that's really violent?
Well, and I think that's a really interesting question because, there are like occupational hazards. So let's say like with detectives or like cops where they have to continue to see maybe child abuse like cases, right? And they have to see pictures of it. So that could, cause PTSD, right? But not necessarily, I think not necessarily kind of volunteering yourself to kind of like see those movies and things, because you can like, it's kind of this willingness to like, to expose yourself to those things. I do think it desensitizes us as human beings.
Okay.
Right. And that's just my opinion, and also clinical, like with personal experience with like, I do think it's somehow to kind of desensitize us, right? And makes us less sensitive, right? Because, and I think we're kind of getting into the fact that like sometimes, and like, I think maybe it may misconstrue our vision of what reality is. So I don't know if it necessarily like watching that would cause trauma. I really don't think so, but I think it does misconstrue like what reality is, right? And I kind of want to step away where kind of we see these social media posts, right? The influencers, right? And people kind of social media, does increase depression, especially around youth. It does. That's just fact. Right.
Yeah.
And I think one of those reasons is, rather than the bullying and like pressures, but I think it kind of gives us this unrealistic view of what reality is supposed to be, right? Where they're always happy and no one's always happy, right?
Yeah.
Or have like this, perfect body or perfect image, right? And so, I don't know if it's necessarily like all the movies are causing PTSD or trauma, but I think it desensitizes us from reality and kind of like makes us like have unrealistic views, either what things are supposed to go, how we're supposed to feel.
Right.
Am I
Right.
making sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And um, I just wonder subconsciously, again, absorbing that kind of thing. Like you said, there's a desensitization reaction. And
Hmm.
is that similar with avoidance in either PTSD? And I'm not drawing direct parallels,
Hmm.
but I'm wondering the subtle, and I may be going a little too microcosmic here in
Hmm.
trying to just, so again, I want to understand the society at large, and again, we're fed this diet of violence or whatever, and I'm being hyperbolic here a little bit,
Hmm.
but just wondering, like, um, if it would benefit us to not abstain. We all want entertainment. We all and usually those narratives of violence in those kind of movies, like the Equalizer with I think it's Robert McCall, Denzel Washington's character. He's taking care of bad people. Yeah, he's doing justifiable vengeance kind of things on people. Now you're kind of like, yeah, you're rooting for that the where is the justice kind of dilemma. So it's very complex. But I was just wondering, and I agree. I think it is something that if you're fed a steady diet, or if you feed yourself a steady diet of this, that it will desensitize you. Because if you see a real car accident and there is really bloodshed and carnage, that will you react in a way that maybe you could make a difference, or would you just be like, more hamburger, whatever, and just, kind of. And I'm being kind of unrealistic and maybe too cut and dry, but I just wonder, it's like I can't help but think that what we consume in the pop culture does have an impact on us. And so I'm not looking so much for, is it traumatizing us necessarily, but like you said, I think maybe we check in with ourselves from time to time and say, if someone was really suffering, or there was something very serious, that you could rise up and go beyond the desensitization and say, I need to act. Again, if you pull up on a car, and I've done this before. When I was 18, I pulled up on a fatal car accident. Well, it wasn't fatal yet, but somebody had been severely injured in a car accident. I just joined a fire department happenstantially. This wasn't in my district, but I just happened as a volunteer. So I get in, and this man is grievously injured, and just not in good shape at all. But I was there, and I did my thing, and he passed while we were, trying to help him. But that's an example of, like, I could have just chosen to drive by and not, engage, but I did because I was becoming a firefighter, and I thought, well, this is a way to train. So anyway, I'm blathering on, but yeah, just wondering about, oh, I don't know. Is it just a matter of telling yourself, or reminding yourself of your humanity when you're done engaging in something,
Yeah.
that could desensitize you? I guess maybe that's the hack.
Yeah.
Maybe
And,
that's the
and
trick.
I think honestly, it depends, but I think like, there's some kind of like, I think media like, um, kind of romanticizes violence. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
yeah, it kind of romanticizes violence. And I think when a person like sees like a real car accident, right? Like you and like maybe they've seen car accidents in like a lot of their movies. Like maybe there's this shock factor, it's like, oh, this is how it looks like, right?
Mm,
Because remember, the body is also pretty smart. When you watch TV, the body's like, oh, this can also say, this isn't real. I know what's going to happen, right?
okay.
But that doesn't happen with a real trauma event, right?
Mm,
With a real trauma event, what happens is that your body goes in this fight, flight, or freeze mode. And you don't really get to pick, to be honest. A lot of people just lean one way. And so we have two parts of our brain. And for my clients, I like to call this our grown-up brain, and then the back of our brain, our kid brain, right? So our kid brain is really in charge of this survival, right? This
okay.
is where hunger, sleep, like even sex, this like our need to survive comes from, right? our grown-up brain, the frontal cortex, is in charge of the reasoning, the logic, right? And so, especially if you ever tell kids what were they thinking, well, they weren't really thinking that much, right? Like the reasoning, it's not the
Yeah.
logic. It's really not there. You can see the difference between a teenager and an adult, right? Like just the reasoning, right? And
Yeah.
so what happens during a trauma event, like sometimes people's brains like, oh, like it's kind of the shock factor. Your body's like, something's happening. I need to do something, right? Well, your brain. And so your brain is like, we can't really afford to think this through. We're in survival mode, whether for ourselves, for other people, right? So this shuts down, this dims. Like it literally, your frontal cortex kind of dims, and you don't like logic, reasoning, it's not really there a lot. And so, our occipital lobe, or the back of our brain, kind of overrides this. Okay. And say, okay, what do we need to do to survive? Okay. And during movies, you're not really getting that, right? Because your brain knows, right? You knows what's going to happen and knows that like at the end, the person's going to get out of the car accident. They're going to be with the love of their life. Everything's going to be fine.
Yeah.
You don't know that in a real trauma, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so when a person kind of like faces this, right, your body either leans to fight or so kind of like either fight the bear, right? Or run away, right? Or freeze. So during that car accident, you could have been like, okay, I'm going to either go, I'm going to go help them, which we did, or I'm going to freeze. I'm just stuck, right? So that's kind of how our brain works with that. And so you're kind of leaning either one way or towards the other, right? In a movie and watching all those things, your brain, your body knows I'm not in danger. So it doesn't feel the need to go into the fight flight. I mean, unless you hear like a sudden surprise, right? But you're in a movie theater, your body knows the environment. So, but I do think, watching all this violence, though, it does give this romanticized view or unrealistic view of what violence or how things work out. Does that make sense? In the car accident, people are always okay, and it doesn't work that way, right?
Right.
And so maybe we have this disconnect of what things actually are supposed to be, right? And versus what things actually are, how it happens, right? And so this is also good where PTSD also actually forms, right? Because it can misconstruct our worldview of how things are and kind of destroys it. And so people are like wondering, like, what do I do now?
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's just the gist of it.
Yeah. It's almost like a loop with the PTSD, huh?
It is, right?
Now, I'll go back to my firefighter talk for a second. I remember that desensitization in that context was essential, because we came up on a lot of car accidents once I was trained as a firefighter and, doing that kind of stuff. And I remember one, a particular DUI incident, and this guy went through the windshield and did a face plant in a tree doing a pretty high rate of speed. And I remember being able to approach this person who was still conscious, which was amazing, but I won't get really gross with the details, but his face was gone. A lot of stuff had happened to his face, but he was alert and talking, and I approached him and I was trying to calm him and just having this conversation, and to see that for the first time, like the accident that I was first talking about with the guy that passed away, I went into blood shock because of what I saw. And I had to try to stay conscious, and then the blood shock went away, and then I was able to stay with the program. But the second or third or fourth time that it happened, no blood shock. I was just very matter of fact talking to the guy, and I said, "This is what's going to happen." And the police were being real jerks to him because it was a DUI, and I said, I was like, "Stop! He's got other things to." And the one thing the guy told me, I'm sorry, I'm going on a tangent. He said, "My father's going to kill me. He's an admiral down at Norfolk in Norfolk Station, in the Naval Station in Virginia." And I'm like, "Dude, if I could get you a mirror right now, that your father's the last thing you should be worried about. There's nothing left. There's really not much left up here." I said, let's get that taken care of. So anyway, but yeah, I was able to be very pragmatic and present to at least try to begin to get this guy focused on what his priorities really are, other than his dad coming down on him. So I guess we're police and fire and even especially military people. You gotta kind of put up this
And
kind of
so,
protective.
well, and what's interesting, right? Because during that time, like they shut down. I bet you shut down your emotions, right? You're like, nope,
Yeah,
can't think about it. Rather matter of fact, right?
yeah, everything
But
was
what
very
happens when you're
transactional.
not in that environment anymore, right? Things
Right.
come, your body starts coming back, right?
Hmm.
And so I think that's what I also see a lot when I work with vets, right? During like their time in the military, like they couldn't afford to think about their emotions, right? They couldn't afford to think about what happened or whether their friend or pal made it home, right? Because they had to get their duty done, right? But
Yeah.
when they come home, your body's like, oh, the body always keeps the score, right? The body's like,
Yeah.
okay, now it's time to work on it, right? It usually comes up, right? And so then we're like, oh, well, I don't want to work on this. So let me find other ways to avoid, whether we're working 60 hours a week, obsessively working out,
Okay.
just
Mhm.
to avoid, right?
Okay.
And so, yes, we could shut down our emotions and just, which like at those times, yes, like cops need to shut down their emotions, get things done, like military personnel, right?
Hmm.
But the problem is in what we see when they're there, but what we see when they're out of that environment, right? When they're home, when they're retired, when they're
Yeah.
back from the military, that's when the PTSD. Well, it's been there, right? That's where it all like, oh, now I'm noticing stuff where I don't have stuff to keep me distracted, right? Where it's not so, things are not so rigid, where things are more unpredictable still a little bit. It throws it
Hmm.
off.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, it's like the real noise dies down, but then the echoes are still
Hmm.
reverberating, and you're carrying that
Yeah.
forward.
It's,
Yeah.
and then I like to think about it. It's kind of like what happens if you're always like stressed in your body, right? But then
Hmm.
you come home and you're like, oh, like I'm not that stressed anymore, but my back really hurts, right?
Mm.
I'm
Mm.
notice you're noticing your back hurt more, even though maybe your back was always hurting the same. You're noticing it hurt more because everything else, all the noise has died down.
Hmm. Hmm. We hear so much of this cliche mind body connection and this and that, but we've been diving into this somatic, as you said earlier, this kind of reciprocity of mind and body, and certain theories on cognition, that the body is cognition, the body is part of
Hmm.
mentation or whatever.
And
So
trauma, I agree. Trauma changes the body.
okay.
People don't, yeah, it literally changes the body. So when your body's in an always heightened state of stress, cortisol releases. And
Mm.
cortisol is a very inflammatory, right? And so when cortisol releases, your body starts storing fat easily.
Mm.
You have heart disease. You're more likely to get diabetes, right?
Mm.
And so when doctors literally says stress kills, stress literally kills, right?
Mm.
Yes, your body needs a normal level of stress to function, but as we go with like PTSD and trauma framework, right? After people are done with that environment, because your body's, in such a high level of cortisol and, and like constant state of like trauma, their body just continues to feel that they need to be hyper vigilant, right? They
Mm.
need to be
Mm.
continue on aware. And so it's like kind of, it's destroying your hormones too, right?
Mm. Mm.
Migraines, stress. So our body, our mental health and our physical health it's honestly so connected. And that's why, as a practitioner, I just feel like the need to, when I'm working with patients with trauma, we make sure their sleep, their eating, are also on board. Their hydration are also on board,
Mm. Mm.
right? Because,
Mm.
you may be getting better mentally, but you may not be able to feel it if your body feels like crap.
Yeah. Yeah. Which makes me wonder, and you mentioned this earlier about somebody with PTSD doing anything but, and the rigorous physical workouts, et cetera. But when one is in treatment for PTSD, what do you envision, and what do you work with in terms of bringing the body on board? So are there uh, entry level practices or you know, beginning practices for a person recovering from PTSD that fit with the first stages of recovery and healing. And then you can move up to, you know, to other things, just like the psychotherapy moves up. So what is like a good course for someone who's just entering into recovery with that?
Yeah.
Physically.
Yeah. And yeah. Well, and like it, you know, as a therapist, like it honestly just depends. You know, if I see, you know, a person who's like, let's say if I see someone who's, you know, doesn't go to bed since 3 a.m., like non-regular meals, like very like their body's just stressed. Maybe instead of doing EMDR, we just really focus on simple like taking a walk every day, drinking water, eating 3 meals a day, going to bed like by 11 or 10, right?
Okay.
And so, you know, we kind of want to help the body de-stress. And not everyone needs that, right? Even with people maybe are not like, they feel like they have some kind of level of functioning. Maybe I go to like straight to one of my other modalities, right? But with certain modalities, I want to make sure that they have some baseline of functioning before I even like jump straight into like the PTSD work, right?
Okay.
Sometimes, you know, PTSD also can cause like emotional deregulation a lot of times, right? So sometimes just, you know, if we tackle the trauma first, we realize the emotional deregulation, like they're able to regulate. It honestly just depends on the person. Yeah.
Okay.
And, you know, and that's, you know, when I meet with my patients, like I spend doing an hour and a half, 2 hours, like in depth, like assessment with them because I really want to understand them as a person, you know, what medications they are, how they're feeling before, after. I can't give you a straight answer, but if a person's like, listen to this and they're like, I feel like I'm never like I have some trauma, but I'm not ready to work with. I feel like maybe we start taking care of our bodies because trauma is stored in the body too, right? So maybe we walk every day, get some kind of movement is so good for you, right? And making sure you're hydrated, eating rebalanced meals a day.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because when people like miss meals, it also like their like blood sugar and emotions are so connected, right? So it doesn't help anyone.
Okay.
Right? Make sure everything like set. And then maybe like other things that are helpful is like if the person's feels comfortable with someone touching them, massages helps like release the cortisol and decrease stress, right?
Okay.
Those acupuncture is also helpful, actually. And so things that moves the body helps release stress and cortisol, right?
Okay.
I would be careful doing things that are like very high intensity because that drives up cortisol. And if you're always like, if you're very person who has a lot of PTSD and can't do a lot of like they're jumpy, sometimes when you're like cortisol, your body doesn't know if it's really exercise or you're really in danger.
Yeah, that's true.
Right?
Yeah.
So I would just yoga, like medium to low impact exercises if they're very basic. But also I encourage them to just go to therapy or journal. Yeah. Or play. Like, I know it's weird, but one things that people always recommend, like for children with PTSD, they do play therapy and you're not playing, but like having like doing something artistic really helps body also release, like either drawing or painting. If you're that kind of realm, they can do that.
Okay.
Painting their emotions. So there are things I've done too, painting our emotions. If people are not really ready to go there, we kind of do more artistic things to kind of help them get ready.
Yeah. Yeah. And it sounds like establishing a normal routine and a normal pattern that affords the body, as you said, rest and nutrition and things like that, that's sort of subversively bringing in a wellness practice that is no strain or perceived,
Yeah.
insurmountable task to a person who, again, is hamstrung by this loop, this circuit. And so that's awesome that they can just start with something so subtle that most of us take for granted, that you go to bed at a certain time, you get as many hours as you can, and then you eat regularly and make, as best you can, healthy food and take
Yeah.
care of that body. Yeah, because then that enters into that circuit, I guess, that it's
It
feedback.
really does. It helps regulate the blood sugar,
Okay.
which when you have high blood sugar, low blood sugar, it greatly impacts the mood, right?
Mm,
And
mm,
so, and also when we're thinking about that, with PTSD, your nervous system has been shot
mm,
and have not been regulated. So doing those stuff, or even chiropractic, doing those things literally helps regulate your nervous system and helps it to function better, right?
mm,
And so if
mm,
you or don't feel like you want to go to therapy, or if we do things to regulate your nervous system, you will function better.
mm. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Makes sense. And one of the things you had mentioned, either in our pre-meet or the info that you gave me prior to getting together today, was social connection. And let's talk to that as an extension of what we were just
Yeah.
covering. And
Well,
so let's just take John or Mary or
mhm.
whoever, with, in the flow of that taking care of the body, and then slowly working with cognitive therapy or psychological therapy. But then how do you integrate, like, obviously if they're, and then I'm guessing here, but if they're dealing with PTSD, that maybe getting into large crowds, maybe getting into a group to share and be vulnerable and all these things. So again, just like the entry point for the body, what are you seeing with social re-engagement or engagement or however you want
Yeah.
to frame that?
Yeah. So let's say there hasn't been our intern therapy, because even in the therapy I do, like some of the things that we do to help them is, go to restaurants that you've been avoiding, help connect with people, right? So one thing with like, if we'll start with like very beginner, and then we'll go
Hmm.
in. But let's say if a person is like don't want to touch that, and they're like, what I can do is just regulate my nervous system. So um, maybe like if they don't want to, go and like meet people, there's like simple things. Maybe I I am not a fan of video games, right? But in a way that help people can socially connect
Okay.
in a way, especially if people are like isolated and feel like, hey, I don't have a lot of connection, I don't have any support. Maybe they have support during their video game with their video game
Okay.
friends. Okay, I definitely don't encourage spending a lot of time on there.
Right.
Not at
Right.
all. But there's some, you can text someone, right? You can like just, or um have a phone call with someone, or we even do little things like, I want you to go to the grocery store, and instead of the checkout line, I actually want you to go to the cashier. And
Uh-huh.
I want you to go to the cashier, and I want to ask you, I want just simple, how was your day? Right? And just because they usually ask how your day, I want you to answer them back, right? And then we build up from that. But there's small little things, right? Even social connections that are not like you feel like are not significant are important, right? And so
Hmm.
like I know for me and my husband love to go to our workout class, right? And we're
Okay.
not very like good friends with them, but we still want to go to the same workout class because we know them when we're like okay friends, good like acquaintances with, because they provide some kind of like social connection.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so like I would say, go to the grocery store, say hi to someone, if you have someone delivering your food, maybe have a small conversation, even the Amazon guy, right? We can do little things to feel
Right.
social connection. If you're like, no, I don't want to see people or anything, and you're like, just like rather, text someone, you can give them a call, text someone, anyone you're comfortable with, right?
Hmm.
Um, just so you can have that little bit of social connection. Right?
Okay.
as we expand out, right, I think as a society, we're not really as we are, but we're not as socially connected. I think
Mm-hmm.
as a
Mm-hmm.
society, we're more superficially connected because of
Mm-hmm.
social media. And I think
Right.
that's a problem,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Yeah.
And I think this like superficial connection really like is detrimental to mental health, to be honest, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because, we're used to saying, "Hey, how are you?" and always used to say fine, right? Even if things are not fine, right? And so I
Yeah.
think one of the best things for like, especially, I think, as a society, I think everyone can agree that things are not the most stable right now.
Mm-hmm.
Things
Yeah.
feel
Yeah.
hectic. For a lot of people, it feels uncertainty, and uncertainty drives fear,
Mm-hmm.
right? And when people are fearful, it is not the most, um, I don't think we're the most productive when we're
Yeah.
fearful. We kind of feel stuck, right?
Mm-hmm.
Kind of with PTSD, kind of we feel people feel stuck when PTSD. There's a lot of fear, right? And so I think especially fear about the unknown, fear about people who are different from us. So I think the best way, is to like have a conversation with your neighbor that believes something totally different than you, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
or like have a conversation or maybe not believe something totally different for you, but believe something a little bit, you have different views, right?
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think when you talk to people, you realize people are having the same fears, maybe like for different reasons, but similar fears, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you learn
Yeah.
to like, oh, okay, like I'm not the only one feeling this way. Social connection helps brings validation,
Mm.
right? And
Mm-hmm.
it helps the world not feel like such a scary place, right? Because one thing with mental health and PTSD, we have this term like, oh, no one can ever understand me, right? No one ever went through this,
Right.
right? The world is not safe. People are bad, right? So social
Mm-hmm.
connection helps kind of like disprove that theory there. There's some bad people, but there's some very good people
Right. Right.
out there, right?
Yeah.
And there are people who are like, oh, people are not always out to get me, or people are not always thinking like I'm a loser, right? And so
Mm.
like I think social connection helps disprove some theories in our head. And I think that everyone has of like kind of this negative self-talk we sometimes have of ourselves, right?
Mm. Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know, I think social connection is just very important with mental health, especially in PTSD treatment. We do, we, like all the modalities I see, like we do have some elements of connection, but just in general for the average person, you know, not the average, sorry, that came out right, not the average person. In general, for a person maybe not experience the PTSD symptoms,
Right.
have having social connection can still boost your mental well-being.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. That makes perfect sense. It's across a scale, right? Yeah. Everyone benefits, whether they're really struggling with
Mm.
that PTSD or otherwise, or they're in a fairly good space, a headspace. That social connections will help maintain that good headspace or that good emotional, affective, or valence, or however you want to say that. What I'd like to do now, because we've gone about 45 to 50 minutes, if you can believe that. These things go so quickly sometimes. What I'd like to do now is focus on you. And we talked before we hit record that you are in a jumping off point. You're in a place where you are uh, you're putting something together for yourself as a practice. And I want to ask you a few questions related to that. But let's start with your telling us about this journey that you're embarking on, or however you want to call it, your nascent project to do your to be your own person in this domain. So if that's the right way to say it, or you can say it better, and I'll
Oh,
just
that's
I'll just
that's
nod and be like,
great.
that's what I meant to say. But
Well,
you're starting your own practice. Let me, for the
hmm
audience, so they don't think I'm an idiot. You're starting your own practice. So let's talk
yeah.
about that, and I'll ask you a few questions about that before we bring this conversation in.
Well, I'm starting my own practice, something small on the side. where, I, I am trained in with trauma, like the three main treatment modalities, maybe like a doctor would prescribe. I'm trained in all three. And I realized that like I want to be able to offer that to people. Actually,
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of great places like that offer good PTSD support, like NEMA Health is really great one. But I also want in a way um, kind of offer my training to a little bit more people because I'm training all three. And so I've been thinking that, I was going to offer a virtual therapy practice. And for me, it came to a point where I really don't think therapy, especially for trauma, should be forever, right? Especially when there's a lot of like evidence-based treatments out there that are good for PTSD, right? And so, you know, I just feel like, it's my duty to kind of help share these treatments with people. Um, and so for me, like I've just felt like, well, if I can share these treatments with people, a lot of times don't come, like people don't continue to need a sense of help after that, right? And so I think one good way to, I worked and I do subcontracted with Nema Health, for example, where they do cognitive processing therapy and intensive. And after 12 treatments, 90% of people experience a significant decrease in symptoms of PTSD, right?
Oh, okay.
And then they don't need to go to treatment after that. They have like a monthly check-in if they need it, right?
Okay. Okay.
And so for me, I'm not doing that modality, but I'm offering cognitive process therapy, EMDR, prolonged exposure, because just depending on the specific person, it may work, like something else may work better, right? And so my practice is I'm still in the building blocks, but it's going to be virtual. And for me, I think it's important for people to access therapy because I think, in the United States, I think it's really hard, especially if things are 9 to 5, right? Then you have a job that's 9 to 5, right? A lot of people, there's some barriers to like mental health and mental health assessment treatment. Right? And I have to work to actually afford treatment, but if I'm actually in treatment, how can I work? And so I'm offering evening session and some weekend sessions. For me, with my, it's going to be called revision trauma therapy. And I think, that journey honestly came about with, I think I guess honestly my first journey, right? I realized that I'm a better therapist because I got the right help, right? The right treatment help, right? And I feel like when people are not receiving the right treatment help, it limits their ability to maybe function in the professional world or just personally. And so that's how, I'm sorry, it's a very tangible way to come in, but that's how it came together after like 7 years out of school that like I just figured out that this is what I need to do.
Right. Right. Well, it has to, you know, pave its own road basically as it moves forward, right? So yeah, time is less consequential, I think, in that you are, it's like a gestation process. You want it to come out right. You want it to be what fits for you so that you are the best that you can be and do what you can. Now, you mentioned some of the modalities that you work with, and you are entirely virtual, or are you going to do some office?
I'm going to be entirely virtual. So, as a therapist, we have to be literally licensed in every state we see people. So I'm
Okay.
licensed in Utah, New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. So I
Okay.
will be entirely, virtual for now.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
But in this day and age, and like you just said, which absolutely makes sense, is we're all committed to very tight time schedules right now. So getting to an office, getting to a chair, as it were, it may not be feasible for a lot of us. A lot of us work long hours, and so I think that's a good place to be, a good position to be in, to make yourself accessible and available.
And virtual really works, right? Virtual has the same benefits as in person, right? With virtual, I don't have to know that you have pajamas at the bottom.
Yeah,
right?
True. Yeah,
it doesn't matter,
My SpongeBob underwear or pajamas.
You don't have to tell me that, right? And so I think virtual therapy really opens a lot of people up where they don't necessarily have to stop seeing their therapist. And maybe if the therapist is licensed in the same state, right? If they go on a small trip out of town, they can just hop on. So
you'll be there.
I'll be there.
And available. All right. So this might not be a fair question, but I ask it of people who I am inspired by and who are, just rolling down that path, paving their own path. And if you were to put on your imagination cap and think about a few years down the road, do you see yourself writing a book? Do you see yourself involving visual, artistic things, media? I'm throwing things out here, but you feed back to me. What if you put your little imagination cap on? What would you love for yourself in a few years, or 10 years, or 5 years? I know, and this is not fair because you're doing something momentous right now. But I'm maybe looking for when you have those moments that you're like, oh, I could do this, what you are doing, and then, is there something else where you're just like, oh, wouldn't that be something for me to do?
Right. I think it'll be interesting to go a couple of different ways, right? Because Mom and Dad's trauma, but also I feel like I would honestly love to put on create a program to help people address, and I do this specifically in therapy, help people address physical, mental, emotional health, just all together, right? Mm-hmm. Because just a simple program. Because, for example, a lot of people have no idea how much your blood sugar impacts your mood, right? It's crazy how much it just impacts everything. Or for women, their monthly cycle impacts their mood and their weight and everything. And so I would love to do that. I also think I would love to I grew up with my sisters. My parents died when I was young. And so I would love to host a podcast about kind of unconventional parenting, right?
Okay.
And how people it shaped people's life to become who they are, right? Because I think some people, the American standard household, a lot of people didn't grow up that way, right? But there's a lot of amazing people, who grew up this unconventional households, right? And not as, because I was very lucky to have my sisters, and they did the best in raising me all, but not every unconventional household turns stuff into tragedy. Does that make sense? And so I think a lot of people who grew up in different environments, or maybe the most unique environments, really have a different perspective. Mm-hmm. And so I would love to host a podcast about that if I can ever get the nerve, but
I think there would be an endless ocean of potential guests because, like you said, and I fully agree, because I'm a 70s latchkey kid, so I had a single parent, and that was a unique experience. It wasn't a nuclear family necessarily, and it was fine. I came out fine. But I think given the diversity of what's out there, you would have an endless fount of conversations and experiences, and distributing those conversations out for consumption, I think, is good, because I'm sure you would intuit that reinforces someone who, again, I think you hit this earlier, am I weird? Am I strange? Am I a freak? Am I the only one going through X, for whatever, or dealing with the fallout of X or whatever? So I think that would be really neat to touch the lives of people who are hungry or curious, or launching these inquiries into was my childhood really freaky deaky, or am I the only one that went through that? So yeah, that's really
I
neat.
think
And
normalizing it, right? That
mhm, it's okay.
like
Yeah.
honestly, like, sometimes, that what single parent household is so much more healthier environment than like the two parent household with a lot of contention and violence
Oh
all the
yeah.
time, right?
Yeah.
And so I think in a society, we really need to take a step back of what is really the ideal. Is the ideal the two parent household, or is the ideal creating a healthy environment, supporting people and parents to create that healthy environment? And because
Right.
I think we're getting like everything's mixed up and we're not focusing on the right things.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, no, I think there's a very restrictive definition of what the ideal family is. And I
Mhm.
think, circumstances deliver, occasions where, again, there is a single parent. It could be a death, could be a divorce. And like you
Mhm.
said, that's, my situation. The house was violent. The one spouse, was able to flee the violence it settled down and then things were as normal as they could be. If it's aunties or grandmas or moms and not, and it doesn't matter as long as there's something there, that grounds and helps give that child the structure they need to feel safe and feel loved and see what healthy
Mhm.
humaning might look like. And so all the other details to me are not of great consequence. So.
Yeah.
So that's really cool. That satisfies that question 100%. So I appreciate that. All right. So this is what I'd like to do next. And if there's anything we didn't discuss or cover in the last about basically an hour that we've been on, what would you like to part with, or what would you like to close with as any amendment to the conversation, or something, you want to just a witty philosophical statement or anything, whatever. It's yours. I give it back to you, and whatever you want to close with. Let's hear from you.
Well, Justin, you've been great, and I think we've gotten a lot of things covered. Um, but I think I want to say, mental health is not just one approach,
Mm,
right? Mental health necessarily may not look for everyone like sitting in a therapist's office and talking about your feelings or doing specific modality. Mental health, really to get the best out of mental health, we need to really work on your physical, emotional, spirit, like all those aspects together
hmm
to really land in a solid mental health place, right? And I want to close with your viewers and your listeners that there are a lot of resources out there,
Okay.
and when I do my own practice, Justin will link the website, but on that website, I'm going to also share resources because I
Okay.
feel like, even if I don't take insurance, mental health, should be accessible. So I'll list resources that are maybe more accessible than others.
Mm,
And so, yeah, there's mental
yeah.
health out there. And, I think every day is a day to continue to work on your mental health, whether setting boundaries or limiting your use of social media.
Mm, hmm
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Okay. Say the name of your emerging practice again for me.
Revision trauma therapy.
Revision trauma therapy. To the audience, there as yet no links. Maybe by the time I release the conversation, we might. I don't think we will, but because I'll probably put you out a week from the recording. But when the links are there and available, they will be in the show notes or the description field. In the meantime, I will have other links to gain access to whatever you have available right now, Martina. So, but just to the audience, as things come on board, I will be sure to include those in the description field below. So stay tuned for that. So if you're watching this conversation in 2027, and right now it's April of 2025, there's going to be stuff there. I know it. Podcasts and therapy and revision website links and all that stuff. So Martina, thank you for this conversation, and thank you for doing the work that you do. We are mm, we are a culture and a collective, whatever you want to call us, that we can take care of each other and support each other. And you're doing good work in good faith, and I appreciate that that you're out there doing that and helping people, especially with things like PTSD and working with veterans and so forth. So I appreciate you for what you do, and I'm sure I just wish you the best.
Oh, thank you, Justin. It was a pleasure to be on your podcast. It's always
Yeah.
fun talking to you.
Well, oh, thank you. I appreciate that as well. And what we could do perhaps is give you some time, and you can share what's going on with you in down the road, and where your growth and evolution. Again, not only with this practice, but what you're discovering with other things that you're inspired to do as things unfold. So let's leave the door open, and we can have you back, and check in with you in a little while and see what's going on.
Yeah, I would love that. Thank
All
you.
right, wonderful, wonderful. To the YouTube audience, thank you all so much for your attendance, your presence, and your attention. Appreciate that. Martina, I'll say goodbye to you after we stop recording. But to the YouTube audience, take care. Thank you very much, and especially subscribers. I'll see you all in the next episode.